The Sacrist of Saint Radegund by Arthur Gray and read by Christopher Halton. As the church bells tolled across medieval Cambridge, death walked silently through its streets. The year is 1431. Within the quiet walls of the ancient Priory of St Radegund, a funeral is about to take place. One elderly nun has spent 40 years in almost complete solitude, devoted to the service of the church. Few knew her, fewer still understood why she chose such a life. But every old building keeps its secrets. Behind the stone walls of this forgotten convent lies a story of love, sacrifice, loss, and a promise carried faithfully through the darkest years of the Black Death. It is a tale that begins with a funeral and reaches back into one of England's greatest tragedies. First published in 1919 as part of Arthur Gray's acclaimed collection Tedious Brief Tales, the Sacrist of Saint Radegund draws upon the real medieval Priory of St Radegund in Cambridge, today known as Jesus College, and blends authentic history with quiet, haunting fiction. This evening I invite you to step quietly into 15th century Cambridge and discover one of Arthur Gray's finest and most poignant supernatural tales, the Sacrist of Saint Radegund. On a certain day in mid-June in the year 1431, the tolling of the bell in St Radegund's church tower announced to the neighbours of the priory that a nun was to be buried that day. In an interval between church services, the nuns wander in the garden, which is also the graveyard of St Radegund's, and lies sequestered next the chancel walls. Today they are drawn thither by a new-made empty grave, for a funeral is a mildly exciting incident in conventual routine. But three sisters sit in the cloister on the stone bench next the chapter door. Also a small novice is curled up on the paved floor with her back against the bench. The day is warm and the church wall casts a grateful shadow where they sit, and because labour and silence are enjoined in the cloister, they rest, and two of them gossip, and Agnes Senclow, the novice, listens and lays to heart. The two who gossip are Joan Sudbury, Succentrix, and Elizabeth Davies, who is older than Joan and holds no office in the monastery. With them sits and half dozes Emma Denton, who is very old and very infirm. She does not gossip, for she has hardly spoken a word of sense these 40 years past. She is a heavy affliction to the cloister society. She lives mainly in the infirmary, and does not attend church. She knows when it is the hour for a meal, and she knows very little else. If she speaks an intelligible word, it is about something that happened 40 years ago. She remembers the great pestilence in 1390. What ailed poor Sister Emma to bring her to this sad pass? When she was young, she was something of a religious enthusiast, and because enthusiasm was rare in the cloister, she was promoted by her sisters to high station. When they made her sacrist, she had her one and dearest wish, to have the charge of the beautiful church, of the books, vestments, and jewels of the sanctuary, to live in the holy place with holy thoughts for companions, and in the unfailing round of holy duties. Was not that a happy lot? Dignified too the office was, for in the little cloister world the prioress herself was scarcely a greater lady than the sacrist. The sacrist did not sleep with the other nuns in the dormitory. Her constant duties did not allow her ordinarily to take her meals in the refectory. Like the prioress, she had her own servant to attend her, her own house to dwell in. Her habitation was built against the northern chancel wall and consisted of 2 chambers. From the upper room, through a hole pierced in the wall, she watched the never-dying light that hung before the high altar. But it was not good to be sacrist for long. The unvarying routine of duty produces torpidity. Holy thoughts uncommunicated end in cessation of thought. The solitude was deadly. The office was not coveted by the sisterhood, and was seldom held for more than a year or two together, wherefore they rejoiced when Emma Denton held it for 9 years. For 9 years she trimmed the sacred lamp. During 9 years her own light dwindled out, and at last the world became dark to Sister Emma. The crazy belfry rocked with the swaying of the bell, which, being cracked, was doubly dolorous. The sound of it roused old Sister Emma to a dim consciousness of what was passing, and she spoke to nobody in particular. "The bell," she said, "the bell again. Last week it tolled and we buried 2. Now there are 2 more in the dead house." "The saints protect her," said Sister Joan. "She is at her old talk of the pestilence year." "It was Assumption Day," continued the old nun, "when we buried them. We had no mass that day. Today it is the cellaress and Sister Marjorie Cayley. God pardon her for a sinful woman. No, Marjorie is sick, not dead, and I forget. "Marjorie Cayley," cried Joan Sudbury. "What quoth she of Marjorie Cayley that goes to her grave today? Marjorie Cayley, that has been our most religious sacrist ever since yonder poor thing fell beside her wits." "Religious you may call her," said Elizabeth Davies. "But God knows, and Sister Emma knows, that of her which we know not. 30 years have I lived in St Radegund's, and I remember not the time when any but Marjorie was our sacrist, and well I know that the sacristy has been her prison all those days. But I have heard Sister Emma say in her dull way that Marjorie once knew the convent prison too. Well, 12 years I have spent here, and never had speech with the sacrist. Once I was alone in the church when it was dark, and the daylight only lingered aloft in the roof, and of a sudden I lighted on her in the chancel, busied in her office. Her pale face in her black hood showed like a spirit's, and I thought it was the blessed Radegund that had come down from her window, and I was horribly afraid. I think that from the sacristy window her eye followed me about the garden as I walked there," said Elizabeth. "It follows me still, and it makes my flesh creep. What good woman would shun her sister so? Heaven rest her soul, for be sure she has much to answer for. If she has confessed herself, it is not to our confessor or the prioress, for I think she has hardly spoken these many years to any but Alice Portress that waits on her." "Yes, Alice was with her at the end. It was Alice that dug the grave. Alice rings the knell. Alice laid her out in her sacrist's chamber, and she has placed 2 white roses on the dead woman's breast." "Roses!" said Elizabeth Davies. "Roses are not for dead nuns. Whence got she roses?" "That I can tell you," said the novice, glad to take her part in the conversation, "for Alice told me herself. She got them from the churchyard of St. Peter's on the hill." The office for the dead was said, the empty grave was filled, and Alice the portress was closeted with the prioress. "To you, Lady Prioress, not to the nuns in chapter, I confess the sin of my youth. Not to them, nor yet to you while Sister Marjorie lived. She is gone, and why should I remain? 40 years we shared the secret. She is past censure or forgiveness. On me let the blame rest. I ask no pardon, but only to be dismissed from the house of St Radegund, that I have so unworthily served. There is none but myself and poor Sister Emma that remembers St Radegund's before the pestilence year. I was but a child then, and my mother was portress before me. My mother often brought me to the lodge, and I used to play with the novices or sit at the gate when my mother was away. Marjorie had but lately come to St Radegund's, 17 perhaps, or 18 years of age she was. Hers was a proud family, the Kelly of Trumpington, and they were rich and good to St Radegund's. They are gone and forgotten now, but often have I heard old Thomas Key tell of them, for he was a Trumpington man, and he knew the de Frevilles of Shelford too. There are de Frevilles at Shelford yet, but I think that none there remembers young Nicholas de Freville that was Sir Robert's son. I had a child's thought that Marjorie was the most beautiful creature in the wide world, most beautiful and best, and because she was young and fair and gracious in speech, even our hard sisters loved her, and thought it pity of the world when her fair tresses were shorn, and she took the ugly veil. For Marjorie was not religious. God pardon me for my sinful words, but I think she was meant for better things than religion and a cloister. And though she was good and kind to all, Marjorie did not take to her sisters. There was some trouble, I know not what, for she never told, and for some family reason she was sent to St Radegund's, and ill she liked it. So she went about her work in cloister and church, grieving, and there was talk of her among the sisters. Some thought, some said that they knew, but Marjorie said nothing. It is all forgotten now, for the pestilence wiped out the memory of those days. Scarcely 12 months had gone since she took the veil, when Marjorie Cayley disappeared from the Priory. You may think what babble of tongues there was in our parlour, how they who were wisest had always known how it would be, and the rest rebuked them for not telling them beforehand. And so for another 12 months she was lost to us, and some sisters who were kind hoped that she would come back, and some who were kinder hoped she would not. Then, one day in the year before the pestilence, comes an apparitor with our lost Marjorie, and a letter to the prioress from the Lord Bishop of Ely. The letter is to say that the Archbishop of Canterbury, in his visitation of Lincoln Diocese, has found Marjorie there living a secular life, and because secular life is sin to those who have entered the religious order, he commits her to his brother of Ely, in order that the lost sheep may be restored to the fold where she was professed, and his lordship of Ely, heaven help him for a blundering bachelor, directs that she shall be committed to the convent prison house until she repents of her wickedness, and when she is loosed from it shall make public confession in chapter, and implore the pardon of the sisters for her enormities. Our prioress was kinder to Marjorie than the bishop meant. Who could not be kind to her? Her prison life was no longer than would satisfy the bishop's inquiries, and as for the confession in the chapter house, it never happened. There were some, though they liked not confession for themselves, who thought an opportunity was missed, and blamed the prioress. For cloister talk is dull if we know not one another's failings. Still the sisters were kind to Marjorie, and very kind when they wanted to get the secret from her. But she said never a word about it unless it were to the prioress. Beautiful she was as ever, but grief and humiliation were on her, heavy as death, and because she confided in none, she lost the friendship of the sisters. To me, who was but a child, she would talk, but scarcely to another, and her talk with me was never about herself. One other there was with whom sometimes she had speech, and that was old Thomas Key, maltster and trusty servant in general matters of the Priory. Him she had known in happier days when he was a tenant of the Cayleys at Trumpington. Her family was too proud and too pious to remember the disgraced nun, and they never visited her. But from Thomas she learnt something of home and the outside world. Then came the dreadful year when the pestilence raged in Cambridge town. The nuns had been used to get leave from the prioress to go out into the town, but there was no gadding now. The gate was closely barred, and none were admitted from outside except Thomas Key. We carried the host in procession about the nuns' croft, and Lord be to the saints! It protected our precincts from the contagion. And while the sinful world without died like the beasts that perish, we sat secure but frightened in our cloister, and blessed our glorious saint for extending the protection of her prayers over the pious few who did her service in St Radegund's. You have heard how the parish clergy died that year. 1, 2, sometimes 3 died in one parish, and the bishop found it hard to provide successors. Boys that had barely taken the tonsure a week before were sent in haste to anoint the sick and bury the dead in places where the plague had left an unshepherded flock. Sir John Deccan, priest of St Peter's Church on the Hill, was one that died, and his successor did not live a fortnight after him. Then we heard from Thomas Key that a mere youth had taken the place, one Sir Nicholas of the Shelford de Freville family, who had but lately been ordered priest at Ely, and we were told that he worked with a feverish zeal among the poor, the sick, and the dying of his parish. Now, when this news was brought to Sister Marjorie by Thomas Key, it was to her as a summons from death to life. Her eye brightened, and her cheek glowed when she heard of the heroic goodness of this young priest. While the sisters shuddered and shrank at each morning's fatal news, she was consumed with a passionate desire to know what was passing in the plague-stricken town, and she plied my mother and Thomas Key with incessant questionings. Who was sick of the townsfolk? Were any of the clergy visited? How went it with the poor in St. Peter's, where the pestilence was hottest? For some weeks she heard that the light burned still at night in St. Peter's parsonage, and that the priest was unscathed, incessant in his ministrations, and blessed by his parishioners, and it seemed as though the sickness was abating. Then, late one afternoon in early August, there came a call for Marjorie. Thomas Key brought it, and whether it was his own tidings or a message from some other I cannot say. Marjorie never told me, but this I know, that she took me apart in the cloister and spoke to me, and she was terribly moved, and her voice was choked. "Little Alice," she said, "as you love me, get me the gate key after Lord's tonight. It is life or death to me to go out into the town. Only do it, and say nothing. No, not to your mother." Young as I was, I knew how the nuns were used to humour my mother into letting them pass the gate, but that was in daytime. At night, in our besieged state, with the death bells tolling all around, it seemed a terrible thing to venture. But I asked no questions. Say it was the recklessness of a girl. Say it was the love that I bore to Marjorie. I stole the key and gave it to her after sundown. What happened afterwards I will tell you as it was told to me by Thomas Key, who waited for her outside the gate. They passed along the dark, deserted streets. The plague fires burnt low in the middle of the roadway, but there were none to tend them, and no living thing they saw but the starving dogs herded at barred doors. They crossed the bridge and mounted to St. Peter's Church. The priest's manse, you know it, is a low house next the church. A white rose, still in flower, clambered on its walls, and half hidden by its sprays, a taper gleamed through the open window, but there was no sound of life within. They pushed open the door and entered. Stretched on his pallet, forsaken and untended, lay the young priest of St. Peter's, the pangs of death upon him. Marjorie threw herself on her knees by his bedside, and Thomas watched and waited. For a time there was silence, for Marjorie had no voice to pray. Only at times the dying man grumbled and wandered in his talk, but little he said that Thomas understood. Then, after a long time, he stirred himself uneasily and uttered one word, "Marjorie," and she, alas the day, put out her arm and laid it on his shoulder. In an instant the dying man half raised himself on his bed and turned his eyes on her, and there was recognition in them, and one arm he threw about her neck, and felt blindly for the fair locks that had been shorn long since, and he said heavily and painfully, "Marjorie Bel-Ami, let us go to the pool above the mill, where the great pike lie, and sun and shadow lie on the deep water." So Thomas knew that they were boy and girl again by the old mill at Trumpington. That was all, and the end came soon. They too laid him decently beneath his white sheet, and Marjorie plucked 2 white roses from the spray that straggled across his window, and laid them on the dead man's breast. So they left him with the candles still burning out into the dark. There was a horrible dread in St. Radegund's when 4 days later Sister Marjorie sickened of the pestilence, and it was worse when we learnt soon after that Thomas Key was visited, then that he was dead. That was the beginning of our sorrows, You have heard, Lady Prioress, how 3 sisters died before August was out, how most of the others deserted the house, and some never returned to it. Our prayers were unheard, and to us who remained it seemed as if the saints slept or God were dead. So it happened that when the plague abated, and the first meeting was held in St Radegund's chapter house about St Luke's Day in the autumn, there were only 3 to attend it: the prioress, the sacrist, Emma Denton, and Marjorie Cayley. For, wonderful it seems, Marjorie, who least needed to live, was the one spared of those who were taken with the pestilence. Presently some old sisters returned, and new ones took the place of the departed. But the sword of the pestilence cut off the memory of the old days, and the sins and sufferings, the virtues and the victories of the former sisterhood were a forgotten dream when the cloister filled again. So when Emma Denton passed into her lethargy, and Marjorie Cayley earnestly petitioned to fill her place in the sacristy, there was not a sister to question her character and devoutness. Not yesterday, but 40 years ago, Marjorie Cayley passed out of life. For you know that, save to me, she has spoken few words since. And though I have waited on her for most of those years, she never breathed to me the name of Nicholas de Fravel, never hinted at the story of her unhappy girlhood. But once in the springtime, just after she entered her sacrist prison house, she entreated me to plant a white rose bush on the grave of the young priest of St. Peter's. I did so and have renewed it since, and one day, by your grace, I shall plant a spray of the same roses where she lies apart from him. I have confessed my wrong in stealing the key and bringing death into the cloister. If you can forgive me so, if not, all I ask is that you let your sinful servant depart in peace. There is a curious aperture in the outer northern wall of the chancel of the nuns' church, which is now Jesus College Chapel. If it is examined, its purpose is evident. It was the lichnoscope through which the sacrist watched by night the light before the high altar. It is the sole abiding memorial of Marjorie Cayley, Sacrist of Saint Radegund. The end. Thank you for listening to The Sacrist of St Radegund by Arthur Gray. Gray's stories are remarkable for the way they blur the boundaries between documented history and imaginative fiction. A distinguished Cambridge scholar and archaeologist, he had an intimate knowledge of the city's medieval past, and he often found inspiration in real buildings, forgotten traditions, and curious architectural details. The Priory of St Radegund was no invention. Founded during the 12th century, it later became Jesus College, Cambridge, and many of its medieval buildings survive today. The tiny opening described at the end of the story, the lichnoscope through which the sacrist watched the sanctuary lamp burning before the high altar, can still be seen in the former Priory Church, now the College Chapel. It was this authentic architectural feature that inspired Gray's tale. The story is also set against one of the darkest chapters in English history, the Black Death. Although Gray compresses events for dramatic effect, Cambridge suffered devastating outbreaks of plague during the 14th century, and many members of the clergy gave their lives ministering to the sick. By weaving these historical realities together with an imagined tale of love, sacrifice, and lifelong penance, Gray created something rather unusual. This is less a conventional ghost story than a quiet medieval tragedy, haunted not by spectres, but by memory, regret, and the enduring power of human devotion. One of the story's most poignant symbols is the white rose, first laid upon the breast of the dying Nicholas de Fravel, and years later placed upon Marjorie Cayley's coffin. It quietly reminds us that although their lives were divided by duty, disease, and the walls of a convent, their love endured beyond both time and suffering. If you enjoyed this reading, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Haunted Tales of Darkness, where we continue to preserve and celebrate the finest classic supernatural fiction, well-known masterpieces and forgotten gems alike. Until next time, thank you for listening, and good night.